All right, welcome to I guess this can be considered a holiday edition of the Gentleman's Wrestling Podcast. We're taping a week early because I realized that our normal taping day would fall on Christmas Day, and I'm like, I'm not going to be around, even though I'm actually not doing that much on Christmas Day, like a lot of people are this year. I'm like, I'm not going to be around, Jason. We got to figure out when we're going to tape this. So we're giving it to you a week early, and today we are doing, because we believe this is going to be our last show of 2020, we're doing our winners and losers of 2020. So what basically me and Jason have done here is we've come up with a list of some winners from 2020 in the wrestling world, some people, things, companies, can be pretty much anything that we feel like have won in 2020, and some things that have not fared so well in 2020. And there actually are a lot of things that haven't fared so well in 2020. Uh, so we're gonna get into that. Jason, any immediate thoughts about just 2020 in wrestling?
Yeah, just obviously the pandemic, obviously was what you're referencing there has affected not only just wrestling, but a lot of our lives. And so obviously, yeah, we're going to touch on that here and there, but we'll focus on, some bright things as well. There's some good things from this year as well, despite all the very terrible things that have happened during this year.
Yeah, and I'm just looking at the kind of the lists we've put together so far, both my list and your list, and pretty much the pandemic, with the exception of maybe one or two, the pandemic has played a role in almost all of them. So, well, I'm sure we'll mention the pandemic. So, people who I know people just want to hear news about the pandemic all the time, and they're not tired of it yet. So we'll get things started. Since I picked first in the draft last week, Jason, I'll give you the first one. Jason, give me a winner from 2020.
All right, so I'll start with Hiromu Takahashi, for the IWGP Junior Heavyweight Champion of New Japan. And I think we'll get to this later on. New Japan has had a very up and down year, but I
Mhm.
think the bright spot for them has been Hiromu Takahashi. Just not only being a mainstay in the junior division. This is for his first full healthy year. He sort of came back last year as well. He had a very great Star Wrestle Kingdom match. I think you put that in your top 10 best matches of the year with Will
Mhm.
Ospreay. Great
Yes.
start, good start to the year. Unfortunately, we didn't get Naito versus Hiromu due to the pandemic, of course, postponing the anniversary show. Hopefully, we'll get that someday. But still, he's has been a very good mainstay for the companies. Still one Star is one of the biggest draws. Of course, the big giftable moments after Evil won the IWGP Heavyweight Championship, just Hiromu screaming into the
Yes.
ether,
A
just in
meme.
agony. Yeah, it was a meme, but it was a perfect character moment. Like, that's a thing that Hiromu Takahashi does. And of course, recently he won the Best of the Super Junior, and he'll be facing LP at next year's Wrestle Kingdom where that will go on to face Taiji Ishimori for the IWGP Junior Heavyweight Championship. But still, Hiromu, one of the big bright spots for New Japan this year.
Yeah, and like you said, Jason, coming back from a really, really serious injury. I mean, there were all, broke his neck in that match with Dragon Lee back. When was that? Was it like last May, last June? I know it
Yeah,
was
around there.
I believe it was at the Cow Palace show in
Hmm.
San Francisco. So, there was a lot of questions about not only not if we would ever see him wrestle again, which was a very viable question, and also just like what was his wrestling style going to be like, because he wrestled in such a reckless way and he took a ton of risks and did all these crazy moves. And so when he came back, there was a question about whether how good is he actually going to be, because we've seen people like Tomoaki Hanma who suffered a very serious injury, and he came back and he's been able to wrestle, but he's just not the same guy anymore. And Hiromu's come back and he's wrestled pretty much the exact same way.
Yep, pretty much.
Yeah, and for New Japan's junior heavyweight division, which has been, I think, for a variety of reasons, probably a step down or two from previous eras and incarnations. You've got things like talent moving on to other promotions. You've got Will Ospreay, who was a mainstay, not being moving up to the heavyweight division. You've got some wrestlers who can't get into who haven't been able to get into the country. There was a long period of time where Robbie Eagles couldn't get in.
Hmm.
ELP, hasn't been back in New Japan since the pandemic started. So that's hurt the junior heavyweight division, but they've really really leaned on Hiromu Takahashi and Taiji Ishimori to kind of keep that division going, because it's still a great division with those guys on top. It just doesn't have the depth as normal. So that's a real solid pick. He's definitely someone who's had benefited 2020. And like you said, we didn't get that Tetsuya Naito match. And that's like, that's a huge, that would have been so huge for him. And he did get to wrestle Evil. He did challenge for the IWGP Heavyweight Championship. But even so, even missing out on that would, I think a lot of people would consider a dream match between Hiromu and Tetsuya Naito. It was still a great year for him.
Yeah, definitely so. What's your number one winner?
Yeah, I don't have these ranked as much because they're so diverse, but my first
Sure.
winner I'm gonna go with Roman Reigns. And
Okay.
he's obviously had a very interesting 2020. He had kind of like a lousy 2020 up until a certain point. He, misses WrestleMania. He's absent for the product. We still don't know entirely why he was absent. I think part of it was that he had recently, his wife had recently given birth to twins. Part of it was concern about the pandemic. He hasn't really told us exactly why he missed so much time, but for whatever reason, he's absent for a really long time in the company. He comes back at the end of SummerSlam, and people seem to think he turned heel at SummerSlam. He really doesn't turn heel at SummerSlam. He just kind of comes back and spears both guys, and people are like, "Oh, what's this?" Because he's wearing a different outfit and he looks different. He I don't know if he lost weight. He looks more shredded, to be honest. Um, he comes back and then he turns heel, which people have been dying for years and saying that's something he needed to do. And he's been basically the only highlight on WWE's main roster. The Sasha and Bailey feud as well. But really, if you look at right now the landscape of what's going on in WWE, it feels like the only positive people are talking about is Roman Reigns, which is a big 180 from how people felt about Roman Reigns before. So I have to consider him a big winner because he's a guy who's struggled to connect with the audience in the way that WWE wanted them to, and he's never been more interesting than he is right now. So I think he's a big winner.
Yeah, and definitely we touched on this a little. We touched on it a lot in a previous episode we did on Roman Reigns. Go check that out and listen to what our larger thoughts of Roman Reigns in general and his whole heel turn and his future and all that. But yeah, definitely, he took time off, and yeah, I think we can kind of assume that was the reason. His wife giving birth to twins. He's a leukemia survivor, and so obviously, he's very much in the danger of catching the coronavirus. And so it's kind of interesting what if as well. What if that match against Goldberg actually happened at WrestleMania? I guess we'll find out once being a Royal Rumble,
Mm-hmm.
according to rumors. But it's interesting what if. Like, what if he's a the whole summer? Would things be the status quo? Would he have actually turned heel or not? Because Paul Heyman was still working as a creative
On
consultant
Raw, yeah.
on Raw, but I don't know if would still have an influence in that storyline as well. And so it's an interesting what if Roman Reigns actually wrestled at WrestleMania. It's a lot of interesting things, but yeah, definitely a big winner. And, the highlight of SmackDown at least, and of course, no one's really watching Raw according to the ratings. And
Well,
so
well, look
yeah,
here.
it's definitely a big highlight.
Everyone's crapping on Raw right now, and for rightfully so. There's
Yeah.
not a lot of good stuff happening on Raw, and at the same time, I feel like a lot of the commentary is aimed at, oh, but SmackDown's good. SmackDown's good. Only SmackDown's good, but Raw's bad. And it's like SmackDown to me really isn't that good. It just has Roman Reigns, and I get you. This is one of those things: is when you nail the big stuff, when you nail the main event picture, which is whatever Roman Reigns is doing on SmackDown, people will forget that SmackDown's full of a lot of the same problems of Raw. It still has a lot of random matchups. It has a lot of unnecessary splitting up tag teams and throwing them together in random groups. It has a bunch of crappy finishes like on Raw, a lot of DQs, a lot of non-finishes for matches. It has a lot of the same problems as Raw, but it has Roman Reigns, so it makes people see the company completely differently, or at least the brand completely differently. And I can't imagine if they didn't have Roman Reigns right now. Um, I don't know like the popularity would be necessarily different, but it did feel like the discussion would be even more damaging for WWE when it comes to what's the current quality of the product, because it really feels like once the Sasha versus Bailey feud kind of ended, and they kind of moved them in different directions, it really seems like that's been the only thing that anyone is talking about in WWE when it comes to storylines.
Yeah, it's ironic that Vince McMahon's one dream is to have Roman Reigns be the top draw in WWE, but at the same time, everything else in WWE is, main roster wise is bad.
Yeah, well, I'm
You know,
also
it just and
I'd be very fascinated to see him. I'm like a lot of wrestlers. I'd be very fascinated to see what it's like for him in front of a live audience right now and how they would react because he's supposed to be a heel, and the crowd's always had wanted to boo him, or at least has wanted to boo him since they started pushing him 5 years ago. So to me, that's very interesting dynamic to see what like would he get cheered? Would he get booed? He's the most interesting person on the show, and usually the most interesting person on the show gets cheered because fans want to be entertained. So I'm very interested in seeing like the irony of it being that he turned heel and now he's getting cheered, which I think is part of the plan all along, to be honest. The idea is that he'll turn heel and it'll make him a bigger babyface down the road. Um, so give me one of your losers, Jason. Let's talk about some losers.
All right, so for losers, I guess we're sort of touched on that. So I'm gonna say WWE talent in general,
Hmm.
and by that I mean obviously with the pandemic, the cost cutting measures that were taken. I think numbers wise, I guess is debated, but I think it's consensus is that they didn't have to do this. Like they still would make a profit even if they kept all the people that they released. And obviously, I think you can make an argument that hey, they're doing better that they're outside WWE. But I think as someone like Mike Bennett has said, like he would have preferred not to be cut during a pandemic. Maybe these cuts would have happened eventually,
Hmm.
especially for someone like Megan was like Mike Bennett, he was unhappy in the company. He's very, very open about that, which would have happened eventually. He would have been cut, but again, during a pandemic is not ideal. And of course, recently, these past couple of months with the third party edict, more exposed than ever is the mismanagement of WWE talent. And we talked again as well. We did an episode on the third party edict with Selena Vega getting fired for basically up in the ante of making OnlyFans account.
Yeah.
Just so many things of the mistreatment of WWE talent, and it has not been good. Even like with the pandemic as well. Like it took so long to get tests done in the performance center, and a lot of people were paid the price for that.
Yeah, I mean the multiple breakouts of COVID-19 that have happened at WWE and WWE shows, that's got to be another strike against them.
Hmm.
There are some benefits, I think, just from we'll kind of get into this because I have a similar related point of actually a winner involving talent, and there is a benefit that a lot of the talent, due to the competitive nature of the now AEW and WWE and other promotions kind of nipping at their heels, wrestlers are getting paid better than they were in the past, and their schedule's lighter in a lot of
Hmm.
cases because they're not doing house shows. But at the same time, all things you hit on, Jason, are correct. The third party edict was a big blow for talent, not a talent friendly deal. The releasing of wrestlers when they didn't need to release them, they were turning it's like they're turning record profits this year, even without the cost cutting measures they had to take to handle the pandemic. So that that's obviously a bad look. So it definitely hasn't been. There are definitely a lot of downs for WWE talent this year, despite the fact that they're the ones that have stuck around are making a lot of money. And also something that you can just touch on, and this is something that's been happening for years and years, and we talked about this a lot last week in our WWE draft where we talked about the undercard guys and why some guys haven't been pushed. Some talent, just it's been a lousy year for their career wise. It hasn't been a good year for Ricochet. It's been probably a very mixed year for people like Matt Riddle and Keith Lee, who have seen themselves called up to the main roster and probably gotten a pay bump because of it, but also kind of feel, especially in the case of Matt Riddle, their careers are kind of stagnant and not being pushed at the level of superstardom that they may have originally envisioned when they signed with WWE. So there's a lot going on. You can just look at the salaries of these guys and say, well, it's been a good year because they made this amount of money, and ultimately everyone's in the business to make money. But at the same time, there are a lot of negatives coming from this year.
Yeah, definitely. So, Jesse, what's your first loser for 2020?
Loser. Well, I'll be. This is an apt week to discuss this, but my first loser was Raw ratings, and specifically Raw ratings. So this week, as most people know, Raw is coming off their record low in viewership, which is 1.52 million viewers. So I just want to, I don't really want to talk about why the Raw rating is so low or viewership is so low, because I think we talk about that all the time. But just to get into the numbers just a little bit, I have some notes here. So let's 1.52 million viewers. Last year, WWE Raw averaged 2.4 million viewers. So there are a million viewers, and I know the 1.52 is the record low, but it's not that different than what it has been for most of 2020. It's usually 1.6, 1.7.
Mm-hmm.
This time it's flipped out. So it's not like this is the 1.5 number is that much of an anomaly. It's not like it was 500,000 less viewers than it normally is. But just to compare that, that's 1 million viewers in a single year. You want to go further back, in 2018, Raw averaged 2.8 million viewers. A lot of people have been talking about 2 years ago, there was that segment where the entire McMahon family came out and they said, we know things haven't been great, and now you're in charge, and we're going to listen to the fans, and things are going to be great again. Since that has happened, and again, that episode of Raw drew 2.8 million viewers. WWE has lost more than a million weekly viewers on Raw. And that's just 2 years. It's not like we're comparing this to, the Attitude Era or this completely different era of time where, there were more people watching or whatever. We're talking about 2 years ago. 2 years ago there were cable cutters.
Mm-hmm.
2 years ago there was Monday Night Football. 2 years ago we all had Netflix and Hulu, and people played video games, and all the excuses that people use for why ratings are down now, that to assess the fact that the product is bad and that's why the ratings are bad. In 2017, it was 3 million viewers. So just those numbers, I think, are pretty staggering when people talk about them, that, we're down 1 million viewers from last year. We're down, our viewership is half of what it was in 2017, which in it of itself, in 2017, viewership was on a negative decline. It wasn't like they peaked in 2017 and things have been downhill since. It's been downhill since then. The more years you go back, the longer you see the slide. It goes down year after year after year. But to think about, 2017 is not that long ago. It's 3 years ago. And there were half as many people watching Raw this past Monday than there were in 2017. That's just staggering, and that's with largely the same talent. I guess like John Cena's not around as much. They don't, have Brock Lesnar on TV or anything like that. But that's with, it's not like they lost a ton of talent between 2017 and 2020 to account for that. It's driving people away. It's these bad storylines. It's screwing up pushes. It's having so many crappy finishes. It's all of those things that contribute to this. And the last piece of the numbers I have on this is kind of interesting. Not only was it the lowest in viewership in Raw history, it was the lowest in the key demo.
Mm-hmm.
So the lowest up until last week, or this week, I guess, the record for the key demo on Raw, the lowest they've ever done, is a 0.45. That was the previous record. The record they set on Monday was 0.41. Which, if people understand the key demo at all, that's like a really big jump. It's not like just like a little bit worse. They didn't just set the record low for the key demo. They blew past it. This was, Secretariat at the Preakness or at the Belmont, like where just like they're so far ahead of the field. They blew everything away with that key demo. So just not a good year for Raw, not a good year for WWE viewership in general. And yes, it's the pandemic, and obviously that took the bottom out pretty fast. But if you look at SmackDown, SmackDown's down from where they were, but they're not down completely. And I know part of that is network television will hold up better than cable. But look at AEW. AEW is basically at where it was at this time last year, and that's with no crowd for a very long time. So there's a lot of things going on with the WWE Raw ratings, and I know we talk about why that is all the time, but I just looked at some of those numbers, and I heard that key demo number about like how bad the key demo number was compared to the previous record low, and it's like, geez, and you 2000s again, like, I get it. People talk about how unpopular WWE is now, and they say, on the Attitude Era, this episode of Raw in 2000 drew 6.5 million people, and it's like, okay, that's like, it feels like a million years ago. It's a completely different world. Looking at 2017, average show of Raw, 3 million viewers, and now they have 1.52. That's unbelievable to me.
Yeah, definitely so. And I do like, yeah, I think we should stop trying to go back to the Attitude Era, but at least, be like AEW, where your numbers are sort of stagnant and they remain on like a decent level, not like decline every year. I think that's the big thing that we should really focus on, not just go back into, oh, let's go back to the golden era. Let's just try to stay stagnant and try to remain neutral in
Hey,
our ratings at least.
if they do that, I mean, look at this rate, right? I know this is not like a fair statement, but just for dramatic effect, at this rate, by 2023, WWE Raw will have no viewers. They lost 1.5 million viewers. In the last 3 years, they cannot continue to bleed fans. And I know that people are optimistic about their next TV deals when those are up because people point to the baseball deals and say, well, baseball's down, and they doubled their deal this year because that's how the live sports TV environment works right now, that you can be doing worse and get more money. But I mean, it's bad. It's real bad. So, switching gears, going back to the winning side, Jason, give me another one of your winners.
So for my next winner, with Sasha Banks. And so you sort of touched on this before, how like Sasha Banks and Bailey, their feud was also one of the watched things, one of the most popular things in WWE, other than Roman Reigns, of course. And yeah, you just go back even earlier in this year when Sasha Banks and Bailey, they were dominating the women's tag scene. I mean, they were the tag scene. There's no other reason to put the tag titles on anyone else other than Sasha Banks and then that obviously eventually culminated into their rivalry, which and on a cell in a fantastic match. She just had a banner year, not only as a singles competitor, as a tag competitor, just really cementing herself as one of the top stars. And I know this year, Becky Lynch, she gone from paternity leave. Ronda Rousey, seemingly done with WWE. Who knows about her future? Charlotte, she had to take a break, and so there's so star that got taken away from the women's division, and there's a question of who's going to fill that void. And I think Sasha Banks has filled that void very well. You can argue whether she's as big as those other names I mentioned before, but she's still a very big name. Obviously gained some mainstream press with the Mandalorian recently
Mm-hmm.
as well. She's really her star is shining even brighter, not only in the ring, but also outside the ring as well, because I'm sure she's going to get a ton more opportunities out of the Mandalorian.
Yeah, so with Sasha, I felt like Sasha is the most complete women's performer WWE has ever had. I think there maybe are
Yeah.
people who are better workers, although that's a very short list. It might be like Asuka, and Io Shirai, and maybe that's it. And I think there have been people who were better talkers or something like that. But I think she's the most complete performers. I think if you look at the four horsewomen group, I think she's the most complete when you factor in ring work, charisma, talking, all of that stuff. Um, but WWE really hadn't given her the big push, long title reign, all of that stuff. She'd obviously been in the mix and she'd been main eventing, pay-per-views before in the past, but felt like this year was the first year they really strapped the rocket to her. They really gave her the big push and put her in a position to shine. In that Bailey versus Sasha Banks feud, you can go back and look at the quarter hours that they did and the viewership that they added. There was a legitimately drawing feud in a era that lacks those, and they were on Raw, they were on SmackDown, they were on NXT. That whole dynamic, them as tag team champions, them feuding with each other, that to me like masked a lot of problems that the WWE Women's Division had, and I think we're starting to see that beyond those two, especially with Becky Lynch out, with Charlotte out, that there's just not a ton of people who have been credibly pushed at the main event level yet. And I think Sasha and Bailey kind of spilling over into every brand helped mask that problem. And now that they're apart, we're kind of being like, oh man, they've got a lot of work to do with building some of these women back up. So I agree with you. She's a big winner for 2020 and well deserved because she's someone who has kind of had the rug pulled out from her before, for different reasons. She's someone who maybe uh, wasn't management's favorite person to push in that position. They obviously liked Charlotte. They liked Ronda Rousey. They grew to like Becky Lynch a lot. Sasha and Bailey as well, kind of didn't really get an opportunity until this year when some of those names were out. And since then, I think they've been really delivered and done pretty much everything that you could have asked them to do in that position. So I would say they're both winners, but obviously Sasha, as the champion and currently kind of being in the main picture is the big winner.
Yeah, definitely. Just curious to see what happens. Charlotte, she's reportedly coming back soon,
Mhm.
so very curious to see like how that dynamic's gonna play out. Becky, she's obviously, her and Seth Rollins are giving birth to a kid, and so she's eventually gonna come back, and Ronda, who knows what she's gonna do, and so I'm very curious to see what Sasha Banks, what she's gonna look like in the mix when all the big names start coming back.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be interesting for her, and I think Charlotte, I think is going to come back to Raw. I can't even remember which side she was on or if she was drafted or anything like
Yeah,
that.
that's the
I almost
thing.
have no ability to understand what time they're on. But the rumor is that, and a lot of people are probably going to listen to this after TLC comes out, but the rumor is that Charlotte's going to be perhaps Asuka's mystery tag team partner,
Yeah.
which seems like she's going to be kind of over there feuding,
Mhm.
probably eventually feuding with Asuka, and Sasha's got the feud with Carmella, which is one of those things where it's like Carmella basically was off television. She comes back, immediately push her to the top, and it just seems kind of sudden. And while I think Sasha's working her ass off to try to get this thing to go, it's just the drop from this hot long term feud with Bailey to like this quick sudden feud with Carmella. That's a big drop, and no performer's going to be able to just carry that up. So I'd like to see her. I'd love to see her work with some of the more NXT women to come
Yeah.
up. Tony Storms, your Rhea Ripley's, your Io Shirai's, any of those people that want to come up. I think that it would be immediately become one of the most interesting feuds in WWE between Sasha and any of those women. So I'm going to go with my one of my losers. And one of my losers I have this year is I have. Oh no, this is my winners. I'm sorry. This is my winner. I
Yeah,
thought for
yeah,
some
yeah,
reason
yeah.
I don't know why we
We
just
got
praised
good
Sasha
winners.
Banks. Yeah, I know we praised Sasha Banks for like 5 minutes, and then I was like, all right, now I got to talk about losers. But no, my winner of 2020 is AEW, and it seems like I know it seems like it because it was a billion years ago, but it was still in 2020, and this was a key part, was that on January, I think it was January 13th, AEW signed a new contract with Time
Yeah.
Warner. And AEW had a contract with Time Warner that was originally what got them on TNT last October. But that contract was for a certain length and for a certain amount of money. AEW was so successful at the start of the start of their television show in the fall of 2019 that Time Warner and AEW decided to rip up their television agreement and create a new one that benefited AEW a lot more. AEW went from getting $19 million per year as a contract from Time Warner to $45 million per year on that contract. So basically, what that is showing that AEW more than doubled their contract value at the start of 2020. And because of the pandemic and the pandemic, hurting live events, hurting ticket sales to shows, hurting merchandise, hurting all of those things that AEW is looking to make money off of, has been able to keep them afloat, just like how the huge television contracts that WWE have let the company a lot keep to generate record business in a year where they're not touring and they're not having fans in the arena. And that's a huge thing for AEW. It's been huge viable for them. So that's a huge win. You can't look and say the company, maybe had a year to impress Time Warner and hopefully get renewed at this end of their first contract, and they've been so successful that they now have long-term security, and it has given them greater financial flexibility. It's allowed them to probably spend more money. It's allowed them to stay alive during this period. And the other thing is that AEW, unlike Raw, has been able to hold up its viewership pretty well. It wasn't pretty at first. They dropped
Mhm.
down a lot when the pandemic first hit and the empty arena hit. And I think that they probably would be doing even better if they were in front of live crowds because they would have a lot more momentum. I think talent would be more over to the viewer because they'd be more over in the arenas. There's a lot of factors in play there. But viewership is still on the up and up. I know maybe this week was a little bit of a reset and a little bit crash back to earth, but they were coming off two excellent weeks where they had done the highest not rating per home, highest key demo number that they
Yeah.
had done in 2020.
Mm-hmm.
So they're back on track. They're back about right where they needed to be. And I just think it's been a good year for them. Objectively, just looking at business wise, not even talking about, you know, matches that were really good, feuds that were really good, that the show is consistently entertaining, all things that I think. But just objectively looking at the numbers that AEW has been able to do, there's no way you can count this other than a big win for them.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, just looking at business wise, there's talks of a new television show.
Yep.
Whether a lot, it's not like Dark is going to become its own show. It's like another show along with Dynamite and Dark. And so I'm very curious to see where that's slotted and what it's going to be. Obviously, they built up a lot of goodwill within the wrestling audience. I think, other than the vitriol of the Wednesday Night Wars, I think for a lot of people, they view AEW in a very positive light. They see it as a good because they bring competition for WWE and they kind of force them to be better. That hasn't really worked for side, but still, there's competition out there, and for talent, it's good for them as well because for so long, if you wanted to make it big, quote unquote big in wrestling, you had to go to WWE. There's nowhere else to go. You go Impact to Ring of Honor, still a ceiling but capped on you, and so you could be poached by WWE in those promotions. We haven't seen yet AEW talent cross over to WWE promotion. It's still, so early, but still, it doesn't seem like it's going to happen. I think if you're an AEW, you're kind of on WWE's, sort of we hate you list. You're on your shit list basically, and so they a lot of goodwill within the fans and the talent as well, because I think a lot of wrestlers they see AEW as a very good place to go. You have a lot of flexibility, and you have a lot of creative freedom in AEW as well.
Yeah, I think you touch on a good point there, talking about the kind of goodwill being built up. And I do think there's an interesting conversation to have about having faith in the creative process of an individual wrestling company.
Mm-hmm.
I think a big problem for WWE right now is that people don't, because of their track record, people don't have faith in the creative decisions that they are making. The immediate concern, if WWE shoots a big angle, one night on Raw or on SmackDown or on a pay-per-view, a lot of the discussion about it will not be about how good the angle was. It will be like, oh, how is Vince going to screw this up?
Mm-hmm.
And if they pitch an idea, you hear an idea pitched that, oh, WWE's planning on doing this, you immediately kind of think, uh-oh, I don't like the sounds of that. I don't think this is going to be good. They're going to screw this up. I don't want, the case in point, people would not be excited for Johnny Gargano or Adam Cole to be called up to the main roster because there's pessimism surrounding the main roster that they will not be pushed well. They'll be embarrassed. They'll get a crappy gimmick. They'll be told to say stupid things. And all of that, though, those beliefs are justified because that's what we've seen year after year from WWE. AEW, because they've been going on for more than a year now with Dynamites, I think that there is more optimism and more faith within its own fan base that they can deliver something. And that if AEW pitches you an idea and you're not super sure about it, you might be like, you know what? I trust the decision makers. I trust the creative process that's in place. And I think that this can be good. And that makes a huge difference in how people feel about the product. It makes a huge difference in getting people over because once people have faith that you're going to push someone honestly and that you're going to make an honest attempt at getting them over and you're not going to, beat them to teach them a lesson, or you're going to mock them with a crappy gimmick, or you're going to, need to squash them to feed them to Brock Lesnar or Goldberg to squash them because you need a hot shot and angle. I think that makes a big difference. And I think the track record that AEW has been able to establish in 2020 makes a big difference in how people feel about the product.
Yeah, definitely. So you want to move on to our second losers next?
Yes, we're back on the losers. Give me a big loser, Jason.
So I guess on contrast to AEW being a winner, I have NXT as a loser.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm not really speaking towards in-ring product. I think you could argue the in-ring product has at worst remained the same. I don't think it's gone worse in any sort of aspect. You could say star power is worse or whatever, but still, it's whatever. There's nothing wrong with the product itself, but what is wrong is their involvement in the Wednesday Night War. It's obvious that they've lost the war. It's been over a year, and there has not been a week where they have actually beaten AEW, and especially in the key demo, which is much more important. I think they've beaten them in total viewership, but there's been very rare occasions they've actually beaten them in the key demo. And obviously, that's very important for advertisers and all this stuff that we've heard extensively, and so I won't go over that again. But still, it's obvious that NXT exists to try to counter AEW, and you can tell that from the way the main roster treats NXT. The fact that we still call it the main roster, NXT has for so long been kind of shed this developmental identity, and it has not really done that. You can argue, hey, well, especially Survivor Series, or for example, NXT was not involved in Survivor Series. The official explanation by Triple H is that, hey, there's a COVID measure. We don't want mixed people in with the COVID. But still, I think correctly is pointed out, if Vince McMahon wanted NXT in Survivor Series, NXT would be in Survivor Series. It would not matter about coronavirus measures. And that's the big problem, is that Vince McMahon does not care about NXT except for its existence to try to block AEW from reaching higher viewership. And as you pointed out before, AEW is still doing very well, even with NXT competing against it. And, that's the big problem. And we've seen before that NXT, when it airs by itself on individual nights or on a Tuesday night, on those rare occasions, it does well. There's a healthy viewership for NXT on its own, but WWE, they don't seem I guess, likely to move it anytime soon.
Yeah, so one of the things with NXT is that, yes, it's not winning the Wednesday Night War. It's not close in viewership often. It's never close in the key demo. But I also want to kind of say that we can't just look at NXT losing the Wednesday Night War and think of that as a failure necessarily, because they can still do good numbers, and if AEW beats them because AEW is doing really well, both companies can have good nights and one company can lose. That's not the end of the world. But what does bother me about NXT is we got a great little example of what both Dynamite and both NXT would do if they were running unopposed, because we got the NHL playoffs forced NXT to move its schedule a little bit, NBA playoffs forced AEW to move its schedule a little bit, and we saw what it would look like if those shows were running on Wednesday night unopposed. And the answer was both shows did a lot better. AEW, I think that was the week AEW did more than 1 million viewers. NXT was way up. Yeah, NXT was way up as well. So we have, proof that these shows would be doing better if they were running unopposed. And Triple H has remained adamant that we're doing what's best for what we think we're doing what we think is best for NXT, which is running on Wednesday nights. Evidence suggests that unless you think less people watching your show is better, then having them run on Wednesdays is not the case. I think it hurts NXT. It hurts NXT to be labeled as a loser in the media and in social media, and people think of NXT as this thing that's losing to AEW. Yeah, so I definitely think that's a problem. I do think that they've had, from a product standpoint, have had bad luck over the last few months.
Oh yeah, for sure.
They push Karrion Kross to the moon, give him the title. First thing he does is get injured, and he has to miss time. That's a big blow. That's a guy that they protected and were pushing hard, and he just gets injured. There's nothing you can do about that. They put the title on Finn Balor. Finn Balor gets injured. Okay, so that's the kind of 0 for 2 there when you're trying to get the title on someone, and now Balor's back. Now they're both back, so that's good for NXT. I think that NXT's in a different spot than it was a few years ago. I think a lot of people act like NXT is worse than it was a few years ago. Don't know if that's true, but NXT was kind of benefiting from just a ridiculous amount of roster turnover that would happen, and constantly being able to fill that roster turnover, which is, we're going to have Kevin Owens on NXT for a year or two. He's going to move on, and we're going to bring in someone else. Sami Zayn, Samoa Joe, Shinsuke Nakamura, Matt Riddle, all these guys, you bring them in, they run through, and then they get called up. Finn Balor, similar path before he was called when he went back before he went back to NXT. But there was a kind of a constant turnover, and it created the freshest wrestling product you can imagine because the names were always changing and they were always good. They're always finding suitable replacements. Now I feel like there's a little more stagnation where it's like the Undisputed Era has been around forever. They've done everything. And even though they're still popular, they're not as hot or as interesting as they were a few years ago because they've just been around forever. And in the old days, they would have been all called up and they wouldn't be on NXT anymore. But now you have to find new stuff to do with them. I think Gargano suffered a similar kind of fate where I think Gargano in a different world, he'd have gone up to the main roster full time, and you wouldn't have to keep finding stuff for him to do in NXT. And he's going to win the North American Championship again. He's going to do this, and he works his ass off. But it's just a different environment in NXT. The show's 2 hours. It used to only be 1 hour. They have more specials. They have I don't know if the number of I think the number of takeovers has increased. It used to only be like 6, and now I think it's 8. But it's just different. It's a different era of NXT.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, like I said before, this is not me calling NXT a loser. It has nothing to do with the in-ring product. It's just more about the outside factors. Because obviously, the women's division is probably one of, if not the best women's division in the world.
Yeah.
You can argue semantics in here and there, but still, yeah, they have a fantastic women's division, and that's not a shot at the in-ring product. It's more a shot at the way they do business, and just them being on Wednesday nights, face-to-face against AEW. It just stopped. And so, Jesse, what's your next loser?
The loser I have is the indies, the independents. And this is one that has to be directly tied. Well, there's actually two things. I shouldn't say that it has to be directly tied to the pandemic, but a huge factor is the pandemic making the indies a loser. A lot of shows haven't run. A lot of companies haven't run. And the financial viability of indies varies depending on the company. Some companies are self-sustaining and don't go into debt. Other companies go far into debt and hope to make it back. It all the downward spiral of the indies this year starts back in March when the pandemic hit. They were all missing out on that sweet WrestleMania weekend spectacle. Last few years, everyone knows that is the biggest weekend for indie wrestling, with so many wrestling fans in town, so much wrestling talent in town. Dozens of shows per day in whatever city WrestleMania happens to be in. Those companies, a lot of them took financial hits because they had deposits down. They couldn't get it back. That was a major news story in 2020, was the indies, losing money on what is supposed to be their biggest money-making weekend of the year. So yeah, that is a factor. And just having, a lot of companies not running. PWG, I'm trying to think of I think PWG did run a show in like January or February, but PWG is one show this year. Who knows if that company is going to be back? Beyond Wrestling did a couple shows. I don't think Drew Cordero. He told me he liked the shows. And he felt safe at his shows, but I don't think he was a big fan of the entire atmosphere brought on by indie wrestling. So, Beyond Wrestling, which was one of the fastest growing independents, and doing weekly shows in 2019, not nearly as prolific in 2020 because of the pandemic. This independents across this country that have not been running. There have been that have run, and they're still remaining viable. Game Changer Wrestling runs like every week, it seems like. But even shows like they did the Collective, which I don't know how much of a success business wise the Collective was, but they had a series of shows, kind of like their own WrestleMania weekend attempt in Indiana, and there were fans there, and I've seen a couple of the shows and enjoyed some of the shows, but there was also a huge COVID-19 breakout associated with the Collective, and that's another thing. There were shows, people, I don't want to call them snitch taggers, but people showing photos on social media, like, this is the show I was at. Look how no one's socially distant. No one's wearing a mask. This kind of stuff. I mean, that's a factor. And perhaps the biggest factor is Evolve closed down. And Evolve doesn't exist anymore. And Evolve was a major independent company. It gave the first kind of opportunities for a lot of wrestlers. It's the first time that I saw a lot of wrestlers that are stars now. First time I ever saw Matt Riddle. First time I ever saw Ethan Page. First time I ever saw some of these other, plenty of talent. I don't want to say like the first time I ever saw Johnny Gargano, but Johnny Gargano, big star in Evolve. Drew McIntyre did well in Evolve.
Mm-hmm.
Zack Sabre Jr., all these names. And then, I feel like people aren't, when it happened, there was some memorializing for Evolve, but I think it's something that people don't really remember it happening, but it's a big blow. And I just think it's been tough for the independents this year, for a number of factors. And
yeah, definitely. You also have Wrestling Weekend, for the indies. That's usually when the star power comes out. That's where you usually hear about the big names in the indie scene. And there's not really that buzz. And that's not to say there's not talent. Definitely a lot of talent. It's just that they don't have a lot of exposure right now because there's not a lot of shows. And especially the big indies like GCW and all that stuff, or AEW over in Chicago.
Yeah.
Those are the big indies, and they aren't running shows that often. Even if they are, there's not a lot of enthusiasm right now because people aren't into wrestling right now. There's a lot of other things going on, and even like the big companies like WWE and even like AEW, like they poach the indies, off of that wrestling.
Yeah, I mean that's a big factor. That's why I didn't want to say it was entirely related to the pandemic, but a big blow to these indies is just AEW existing, which sucks up talent, and then WWE being worried about AEW getting talent. WWE becoming a much more competitive when it comes to signing talent, signing a lot of talent that probably wouldn't have gotten looks from WWE in the past. And this actually blends into one of my winners of 2020. But before I get to that, the impact on the indies is difficult. You took a lot of good talent off the board in an era where they haven't really been able to run. They're not going to, especially in the pandemic, Beyond Wrestling isn't going to come close to having the resources to retain these talent. And it's good for the talent for sure, but it hurts the indies that so much talent is being taken away from them. Especially very early on in their stage. We're at the point now where if you make a name for yourself at one show, the next week you're on AEW Dark, and then the next week after that you're signed to AEW or you're signed to WWE. So that's another challenge that's not necessarily related to the pandemic, is that these talent get taken really quickly from the indies, and the indies aren't relying on individual talents to draw for them nearly as much as they could have, 5 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, also, it kind of is related to the pandemic in some ways because, indie talent, they're seeing that these indies, some of them aren't, reliably solvents, who knows if they can pay you, a fair amount of money. And so, yeah, you do want to get signed. You want that financial stability. And so that is a reason why, some indie talent, they are taking the risk by, just traveling around the country and doing a bunch of shows to try to get noticed. Which I don't blame them. Wanting financial stability, that's not a bad thing. But yeah, you're taking a risk by possibly contracting the coronavirus, which you mentioned before, the collective. While there was a ton of good shows like For the Culture, Bloodsport, those were good shows, but yeah, it ended up being a super spreader events, and that's not really a good.
Yeah, not a good look for indie wrestling.
Yeah, it's not a good look.
Yeah.
It's disappointing.
Yeah, I mean, when I was talking, I talked to Drew Cordero months ago about this thing, and Drew Cordero is the owner promoter of Beyond Wrestling, and they ran a show down in on the Jersey Shore. They ran a show on the beach.
Yeah.
With it was kind of in conjunction with GCW, and what he told me was, he said, when I was at my show, I felt like that was the safest part of the weekend because I was in control. I knew how to seat everyone. I knew what kind of protocols we could take backstage. I knew what we could do to make sure that this thing was as safe as possible. But he said just around the atmosphere around that whole weekend, he said was kind of alarming, like going to the buffet and everyone's there and not wearing masks and doing all of this stuff. And that's a problem for things like the collective. I think from what I gather from the collective, the problem with the spreader at the collective is being blamed not necessarily on guys wrestling in a ring and contracting the coronavirus, but the after parties, the everyone hanging out at a bar afterwards, problems that are happening all over the world at this point, but particularly for indie wrestling. And then that kind of became the big takeaway from the independents, was that like, oh, this person can't wrestle for 2 weeks because they were at the collective and they got coronavirus, and It's definitely a big thing with the independents. They're have not been winners this year, to say the least. So we're gonna go, Jason. Give me your. We're back on losers, right? Yes. I can't believe
back on winners.
No, I just gave my winner. No, I
Yeah,
just gave my loser. Oh my god, I'm so lost on this very simple formula that I came up with. So I apologize for screwing up the pattern. We're back on winners. Jason, give me your third and last winner.
All right, so this was tough. Uh, name off a couple honorable mentions. Obviously, Bailey, of course. MJF, he was a winner, obviously,
Yes,
but he doesn't need me to hype him up. Go
he
on his Twitter
does.
feed.
Oh, he's gonna get you on your Twitter. He's gonna say, Jason Unsaprouth. Is that I screwed up your last name again, but that's okay.
Whatever.
Sorry, apologize.
No, that's cool. But
MJ,
Oscar, of course.
yeah,
But
yeah. A lot
yeah,
of
go
people.
ahead.
No, there's just a lot of people who have done well. I shouldn't say I said your last winner. There are a lot of winners in 2020. A lot
Yeah.
of people who have done very well for themselves. These are just certain people or certain things we're deciding to talk about.
Yeah. So my definitive third winner, I'm picking Julia of Stardom, and so she's currently the World of Stardom champion. Obviously for Stardom, think I think no matter what they do this year, I think the biggest highlight, almost low light for them. I don't want to make light of it, but obviously, the tragic passing of Hana Kimura, I think that's going to be the biggest thing people are going to talk about for Stardom. Obviously, for very much good reasons. She's trash at a young age. Opened up eyes for cyberbullying and all that. But I'm sure it's very tough for a lot of talent, and so one of the talent uh, that has had a good year for Stardom is Julia. I think for last year, she came in from Ice Ribbon and she got a lot of heat. This is for just history for people who don't know. She got a lot of heat for jumping from Stardom because generally in the Japanese promotions, you kind of stay with your home promotion. It's sort of like a loyalty sort of thing, unless you sort of get goodwill, like a Shing. He did all he could in Dragon Gate, and so it was pretty cool that he left in New Japan. But for Julia, she's still pretty green in the industry, and so her leaving to a bigger promotion, Stardom, right away got her a bunch of heel heat, and she played off that. She was the biggest heel in Stardom, and eventually formed her own faction, Donna Del Mondo, and she has really picked up her skill level these past this whole entire year. Before she was decent in the ring, but still very shaky. You can still see like, oh, she's still very green, but she's really polished as a main eventer. She deserves to be in that spot. I believe it's either this weekend or next weekend. She's got like a double title match against one of her faction members, Shiri. But still, for Julia, Wonder of Stardom champion, she's held on to that title for a majority of the year, for good couple months, and she's put on very good matches. Her feud against Tam Nakano is very much, if you have Stardom World, if you subscribe to it, that's definitely worth watching. And so, yeah, she's definitely one of my winners for this.
Yeah, I mean, for people who aren't familiar with Stardom, really, really interesting year for them. Obviously, the Hana Kimura tragedy was probably the biggest story associated with the promotion. I'm trying to think, was Stardom purchased by Bushiroad last year? I kind of remember it being the end of last year, but I'm trying to remember.
Sort of the in between, like December, January.
Yeah. So for if you don't know, Stardom is one of numerous Japanese women's only wrestling promotions, and they really have kind of emerged as being the biggest of the bunch.
Yeah.
But still relatively like a small independent show. A big show might sell out Korakuen Hall, about 1,800 people, but a smaller promotion. But getting purchased by Bushiroad, which is the New Japan Pro Wrestling's parent company, that's a big deal for them because suddenly they get tied in with by far the largest Japanese pro wrestling company.
Mm-hmm.
They have the match at the Tokyo Dome, and I know that when Bushiroad took over, two of the people they really want to push as like this is the new era of Stardom were Hana Kimura and Julia, and unfortunately, due to the tragedy with Hana Kimura, that put a lot more pressure on Julia because the person that she was expected to help carry the company with is no longer with us. And like you said, Jason, there was a lot of heat on her for jumping to Ice Ribbon, for still being green. People didn't really believe in her when she came over, and it was like they're gonna put in that. That was the report was they're gonna push Julia. When they had the match on the dark match at Wrestle Kingdom, Julia was put in that spot, and that was obviously clearly it's like we're gonna push her because this is our biggest match of the year, our chance to expose ourselves to new fans. So and her getting into that spot along with Hana Kimura and a few veterans was a big deal. And she has overcome those obstacles, and she's emerged as she won the Tokyo Daily Sports Award for Best
Oh
Women's
yeah,
Wrestler,
yeah,
which is a award that is um like just like the men's award is very rarely given to foreign wrestlers. And Julia's kind of got a really interesting like life background. She's her I believe her parents are British and Japanese, or Italian and Japanese, but she was born in
yeah.
England.
Italian.
Yeah, she was born in England, but and she eventually like basically applied to train for at Ice Ribbon, and they
Yeah,
accepted her. And then so she made her debut in Ice Ribbon, and then she came to Stardom. But very weird, like I mean, I should say weird, very strange, kind of unconventional background to finding her way into that position. And she's only 3 years into her career. She only debuted in 2017. And for someone to win an award that's pretty fiercely protected as being a Japanese award, and I don't really know the political dynamics of the whole thing. Julia obviously has Japanese ancestry, which certainly helps. So she's not a total outsider the way someone like Kenny Omega might have been. But it's an
hmm
award. Those awards are usually kept. They're very political. The Tokyo Daily Sports Award. They're very political. So for her to win that award, it's a big deal. It's a big deal for Stardom for the success that she's had. And I couldn't find when you mentioned that you wanted to say Julia as one of your winners. I remember seeing I couldn't find it, so I'm not gonna have the numbers right on top of me. But I remember seeing a chart about a week ago talking about like the increase in Google searches involving Stardom
Oh
and
yeah, yeah.
all the social media, and the numbers are from 2020 to 2019 are just through the roof.
hmm
The promotion, it's hard to say in the COVID-19 era because the shows are limited to half capacity and all that stuff. But it seems like Stardom is much, much more popular than it was a year ago. And there are not, I don't know if there are any wrestling promotions that can say that they're more popular than they were a year ago. Maybe Pro Wrestling Noah too, but there's not that many. So to see that kind of growth is huge. And I know some of the Google search numbers and stuff, unfortunately, a lot of that is probably going to be tied to people looking at the Hana Kimura death because that made a
Sure.
lot of news.
hmm
It was related to the reality television show that was watched in America and around the world, so people knew her even if they didn't know her from wrestling. So obviously that's a sad story. It's something that I think will be a major takeaway from 2020 and a major reflection from 2020. But on the bright side for Stardom and the bright side for women's pro wrestling, I think Julia's an excellent choice. It's a good choice. I don't think anyone was expecting you to say that. So
Yeah, definitely. Just an anecdote on the Stardom popularity thing. I think with now Bushiroad owns Stardom. There's been like I think before back when they were fans earlier in the year, I think there was some promotional material for Stardom in New Japan shows. And so that's very anecdotal, but that's still something. Like okay, Bushiroad, they're doing something to try to promote Stardom even in outside of it universe. They're promoting New Japan shows on live events, and so people are on. I think subscribers are up. I haven't seen official numbers, but I think for Brandon
yeah,
Thurston, he's talked as well that like Stardom subscribers are up during the pandemic, and so that's definitely a big up for them.
yeah, people are talking.
Jesse, okay.
No, I was just saying people are talking about Stardom more and more. It's definitely I've noticed the last few years people just getting more into it, and I think the success of Asuka, the success of Io Shirai, the success
Yeah.
of some of the Rihos, the Yuka Sakazakis, the people on the AEW end, I think have helped a lot. As far as people being like, okay, you know, oh, Asuka's from Stardom, Io Shirai was from Stardom, Sane was from Stardom. I want to see what those promotions are doing because they clearly have a lot of talent that I'm seeing on American television each week. I think that's helped as well.
Well, technically, Asuka is not from Stardom.
She's
That's a
not.
misconception.
Oh,
No,
oh my gosh, I'm gonna lose all my Puro credibility. Where was
no, she's
she?
just wrestled in she's just wrestled in various Japanese
Hold
promotions.
on, hold on. I not saying I don't believe you, but let me pull this up because now I'm curious because I could have swore Kana, which as she was known, see, I know something about her. Her name was Kana in in Japan. Let's see here. I'm trying to think where she worked. And she worked like there's so
Just
many weird names. She worked
just
Marvelous. She worked.
No, just various promotions. I don't think she was always like a freelancer.
Oh yeah, here we go. Yeah, well, Jason's right. Her main promotion was Pro Wrestling Wave. I'm sorry, we're getting
Oh
really into
yeah.
the weaves. If you don't know anything about Joshi, you can just ignore this whole conversation because there's a lot of women's only promotions in Japan. Um, she did a lot for Japanese Women's Pro Wrestling Project, the new JWP, Osaka Women's Pro Wrestling, Oz Academy, Ice Ribbon, some previous work for Osaka Pro Wrestling, but Pro Wrestling Wave was her main one. There's a bunch of other promotions. Anyway, that's a sidetrack. So
Yeah,
I'm
because
wrong.
yeah, yeah.
So I was wrong. I was wrong. I now I feel dumb. That's just something I shouldn't screw up. I'm the puro guy at Wrestling Inc. So I'm losing that. Hopefully no one sees that. I like certain having certain like mark-isms, like just some real good facts you can lay on people that
Yeah,
to
sure.
I actually touched on one yesterday when I said that last week I said Kurt Angle was not pro wrestling's only Olympic gold medalist. That's because Henri Deglaine, who was a popular wrestler in the Boston area in the 1920s and 30s, was
Yeah.
a Olympic gold medalist wrestler. He won a gold medal in Greco-Roman wrestling at the 1924 Olympics. And I always like to roll that bad boy out if like someone mentioned that. Like, actually, Henri Deglaine, Kurt Angle, he was the only gold medalist in pro wrestling. So he's like, actually, Henri Deglaine, pro wrestler in the 1930s, one of the, like, it's a good mark. Just some good takes. So now the Stardom one, that's gonna bother me. I'm gonna not get any sleep tonight because I screwed up. Dang, Oscars and Stardom. Okay, moving on from my own psychosis and insecurities. We're going my last loser.
Last
Oh, my
winner.
last one. I can't believe how bad I am at this. My last winner of 2020 this is kind of in contrast to the indies, but I'm gonna go with young wrestlers.
Okay.
And the big thing is looking at the incredibly competitive atmosphere that young wrestlers have found themselves in with the war for talent between WWE and AEW. And I touched on this when we were talking about the indies. The indies were losers because they were losing out on the kind of talent because they were being signed earlier and earlier for these big promotions. So while the indies are losers, from the same dynamic, the young wrestlers are big winners. Wrestlers getting signed earlier. Wrestlers, the life of an independent wrestler is very difficult. It's very hard to make ends meet when you're usually working a second job, or a regular job, a full-time job, and then having to dedicate all your social life to pro wrestling, and every weekend you're going away, and it's very, very difficult. So it's great to see talent get signed earlier, get that financial security, and allow them to kind of progress at that level. We're seeing it, just so much more often. You compare 10 years ago, Jason, to how like allergic WWE was to independent wrestling, and
Yeah.
there was CM Punk, and there was Daniel Bryan, and there were a few names here and there, but I mean, if you were to look at like, I'll use Kevin Owens or Sami Zayn as two good examples of guys who were just for years and years great independent wrestlers. And they were in a Ring of Honor, but the Ring of Honor that Kevin Steen was in is very different than the Ring of Honor today from just a salary standpoint, from a full-time deal standpoint. It was,
Mm-hmm.
very different from what Ring of Honor can offer. But those guys were great for years and years. Everybody knew that they were great for years and years, but they just kept going and going on the independents until finally WWE was like, all right, I guess we'll sign these guys and help, the success of Sami Zayn, or the success of Daniel Bryan and CM Punk definitely kind of broke down barriers for those talents to get signed. But can you imagine like someone like as obviously talented as Kevin Owens, like he's like on every independent show and he's, having all these big matches. Can you imagine that just lasting years and years and, him not getting signed to AEW or him not getting signed to WWE? It's just a completely different landscape where now basically if you show even a shred of potential, all of a sudden they're hot on your heels. AEW's done a great job with AEW Dark bringing in independent talent from around the country. It's great for these guys who haven't been able to work as much because independents are not functioning at a full level. And we've found some hidden gems. Will Hobbs is a guy who was just brought in to do some AEW Darks. And he's been around for a while, but he caught the eye of somebody, and all of a sudden, he's getting signed to a deal and he's getting pushed. Top Flight is a recent example of a team, I think they're 19 and 21, 22 years old.
Yeah.
Just super, super young guys that come in. They wrestle like for a year or two on the independents. They get a shot at AEW Dark, and Young Bucks are like, man, these guys are good. Let's sign them. And all of a sudden, those guys are working full time as wrestlers. And there's a good story the Young Bucks told, I think, on a podcast. I think it was on Wrestling Observer Radio, but they said like the Young Bucks were like, we talked to those guys and we're like, yeah, we want to sign you guys to like full deals. And I think one of them, I forget which one it was like, oh, okay, like, and they're like, they didn't understand what a full-time deal meant. And he's like,
Wow.
I work in a grocery store. Like, will I be doing, like, will I like still work there? And then the Young Bucks like, no, like, you don't understand. Your guys are going to make like good money. You can like do this full time and not do all that stuff. And it's that kind of stuff that's great. I mean, just seeing guys like that be able to find success so early. And deserve success. I mean, they've got great potential, and they deserve to get that opportunity. Ben Carter was a guy who was just like showed up on a couple episodes of AEW Dark, and he got signed to WWE. So he, it's not just AEW, but WWE. Because they see AEW gobbling up this young talent, and they say, well, we don't want AEW to have all that talent. We got to sign Ben Carter. We got to sign Anthony Green. We got to sign all these guys who probably wouldn't have gotten looks, a number of years ago. So I think those guys have really benefited from 2020. They're getting a chance to make more money, and in a lot of cases be put in a better position to succeed. You can say, oh, WWE is going to screw up talent and all that kind of stuff like that. But for these young guys, it's great for them to get down into NXT, get onto NXT television, work matches with great wrestlers like Johnny Gargano and Adam Cole and Tommaso Ciampa and Kyle O'Reilly and all the great workers they have at NXT. Same can be said for the talent getting a chance to work with the good talent AEW. It's just better for these talent. It's better that they're being financially taken care of, and it's better for them physically, not having to grind on the indies all the time. It's just beneficial to these guys. And so while the indies have been hurt, there's a portion of young wrestlers that have won big in 2020.
Yeah, definitely. I don't have really much else to add. Just it's good to see people who want to make wrestling a full-time thing actually get that opportunity, because it's far too often that you see guys that have to they're working second jobs, and they have to work in the real world per se, even though like their dream is to be a pro wrestler. And people, if people who are deserving, obviously deserve a chance at that full-time opportunity. And it's really cool to see, these guys and women on some occasions, get these opportunities.
Yeah, definitely. So we got one more loser left for both of us. Jason, who is your final loser of 2020?
Okay, so I think this has to be addressed in 2020. I think it's a good place to put a loser spot.
Yeah.
Is the speaking out movement. I'll say that. Obviously, it's good that the business is striving to be better, and you can also put Black Lives Matter into this as well. It's good the business is striving to be better, and that talent are more cognizant of trying to eliminate these creeps or these enablers out of the business. Obviously, there's still a long way to go from that. There's still many of these individuals that are still employed by big companies. Obviously, with like Matt Riddle, Velveteen Dream, who have been accused of allegedly, doing these misconducts or actions. And even high-profile ones like Joey Ryan. That was probably the biggest shocker from the speaking out movements, was just hearing these stories that about Joey Ryan, and how even right now, as we're recording, he is suing his accusers for financial gain, because I think he understands that his indie career is over. There's no going back. There's no pretending that things are okay. Like something like we talked about before. I don't know if it was on air or off air. I think it was off air. Mike Quackenbush of Chikara. Chikara essentially shut down because of Mike Quackenbush's allegations. And he's sort of going on like nothing's wrong. but obviously there is something wrong with someone still trying to remain in the business and still trying to gain a profit from the business as well.
Yeah, it's definitely a major story from this year is the speaking out movement, and part of it, unfortunately, there's the optimistic or positivity you can take from it is that
Yeah.
it's good these people are being called out. It's good that
Mhm.
that hopefully over the next few years women feel safer in the industry than they have. I think it was a really really bad look for professional wrestling in general. The kind of content we were seeing, the accusations that we were hearing, the stories that were told. Um, I can't think of any wrestling fan who would hear those things and not make them uncomfortable and not make them question about, people they liked. I said, oh, I told you off air, like I liked Mike Quackenbush.
Mhm.
I talked to him before. He'd been very generous with his time. Chikara was one of the first indies I got into. I thought he was a really good, underrated wrestler. I was a big Mike Quackenbush fan. I did not like hearing those allegations about Mike Quackenbush. Um, and like I was just really 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 disappointed. Felt like I don't want to say I felt like I had been tricked because it wasn't like Mike was trying to trick me necessarily. It was more my own
Mhm.
perception, but I was just very unfortunate that he was not the person that I thought he was. uh that's just me personally and my kind of reaction to it. But so many stories, just the whole British wrestling scene just kind of, obviously independent wrestling struggled with the pandemic, but that's a whole the speaking out movement just seems like a really healthy. It started. I don't know if it's this. I think it might have even started in Brit Res and then kind of moved over into to American independence because
Mhm.
they share a lot of the same talent and that kind of thing. But I mean, you talked about Joey Ryan. I mean, the David Starr. David Starr was the biggest star in
Yeah.
European independent wrestling, and his career is over. And he was someone that was like trying to lead a real social movement within independent wrestling. Uh, that blew up in his face, obviously, with the allegations and that kind of thing. And he's kind of in a maybe he's kind of in the Joey Ryan boat. I think Joey Ryan has more horror stories about him, but David Starr feels like someone who's probably not going to find success in independent wrestling again, or not for a very long time, and all that kind of stuff. It's definitely, I definitely think a big loser in 2020 is that. But hopefully, in the long run, we'll look back on the speaking out movement and say that this was a moment in wrestling where wrestling decided to clean itself up. Wrestling decided to be less of a sleazy industry. Started to be more accountability on everyone's behalf, and an industry that respects women more. And I
Mhm.
think I think in the past few years are trending in a better direction, but obviously there's a lot still going on. Um, that's going to need to continue to be addressed, and hopefully people feel empowered enough to go public with those with their stories, because that's if we didn't have those, we everything would be going on as normal. So definitely a huge story. I think something that, like in 2020, may have been overshadowed and kind of lost in the shuffle, because we were talking about this offline, kind of what our winners and losers were going to be. I was like, oh yeah, like speaking, yeah, we got to talk about that. That's like a huge
Mhm.
story, because the idea of this podcast was kind of to summarize 2020 in a bunch of different ways. So it's a good choice. It's a fair choice, despite the kind of difficulties around the subject. I'm glad you mentioned it. So my final loser of 2020 is I'm going with international wrestlers. And what I mean by that is wrestlers from other countries who worked in other countries. So this is kind of the opposite of the young wrestlers, where the young wrestlers got all these opportunities. You look at a lot of wrestlers from all over the world who were relying on working in other countries that they did not live in for work. And due to the pandemic and COVID-19 travel restrictions, they haven't been able to do that. We talked about it a little bit earlier on the show with Hiromu Takahashi and talking about the junior heavyweight division. Guys like ELP, I use an example of someone who I thought was doing great work in New Japan, was gaining a lot of momentum in New Japan, and basically had to sit on the sidelines for 10 months because he lives in Canada, and wasn't able to get into the US for the New Japan Strong shows, and wasn't able to go to Japan, and has just been kind of stuck for months. And now he finally looks like he's coming back into the picture. But he's someone who has had a really lousy 2020 because he hasn't been allowed to work when he was gaining momentum. Robbie Eagle's similar scenario. He was able to finally get in to New Japan for the Best of Super Juniors, but similar thing, living in Australia, not being able to get into Japan, big problem. You've got talent from Mexico that was good at, relying on coming into the United States to work, especially if they're working on the independents or working in Ring of Honor. Another problem, talent that was working in England and or British talent. A big one is European talent that was, looking to work in the US and looking to, we got Tyler Bate like disappeared off the face of the earth for months and months and no one knew why. Look at Walter, someone like who I thought,
Mm-hmm.
was trending on becoming a big star, but NXT UK shutting down for a while. That didn't help him. They're back up and running, and he's he had that great match with Ilya Dragunov, and I think he's back in the picture. But another guy who just hasn't been able to work because of the kind of international restrictions put on this talent. Uh, all of the foreign talent in AEW, particularly the women talent. We talked about that with the women's division AEW. It's brought up a lot, but the Japanese woman not able to come to the U.S., European women not able to come to the U.S. Huge blow to AEW's women's division. So that's another big factor. Trying to think if WWE has any international talent. I'm not thinking about it. I don't think they really have they? I'm trying to think. Is it outside the
They
NXT UK guys? But I'm trying to think main roster. Is there someone who just disappeared for months because they couldn't get into the country?
not on the main roster, but I was going to mention Sari. She's a Joshi wrestler, and she was
Yeah.
signed. I think she was signed to NXT on a developmental deal. That got delayed, and I think now she's just allowed to just take Japanese bookings until I guess they feel like they have to call her up to NXT. But other than that, yeah, I don't think any main roster guys, because mostly everyone lives in Florida anyway or in the U.S., and
Yeah,
so I
that's
don't
the
think anyone
thing.
from overseas.
Yeah, well, I know like for some reason I remember this specific story. Like Evil Uno and Stu Grayson,
Yeah.
from Montreal.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, there was like a month where they just couldn't get into the country, like right when the border thing was happening. But now I'm trying to think now because I'm trying to think. Maybe they relocated because I should look this up because there's rulings out there. But like for instance, I know for pro sports, teams can't travel to Canada and from the US and back
Yeah.
unless they quarantine for 2 weeks, which is why like the Toronto Raptors are playing their season in Tampa Bay, Florida instead of Toronto because they
Mm-hmm.
can't have teams coming to their home games and leaving immediately. Um, so I don't know if Evil Uno and Stu Grayson can go from Canada to the US like for all these AEW tapings without quarantining because they're on almost every show, so I don't think they're like coming and going quite as often. But
Mm-hmm.
I should look that up. I know like it was with Brock Lesnar. It was like Brock almost couldn't get into the country for WrestleMania because Brock Lesnar lives in Canada, and he had to come to WrestleMania. And they did something like they said like, oh, when you work for WWE, the rules are different, which maybe it's true. And your Brock Lesnar, the rules are different, which is definitely true. Um, but yeah, he was able to get in. So I'd have to look at the U.S. Canada borders, but I thought people could get in now, maybe for work. Maybe if you're from a Canadian citizen, you can get into the U.S., but U.S. citizens can't get into Canada if they have a reason to be like for work. Um, so that's obviously something that is on the minds of everyone. And Pac, was a guy who
Yeah.
was building momentum and it took him forever. He just had to sit on the sidelines. And for Pac in particular, he spent all that time sitting out of his WWE contract. He was gone for like 18 months not wrestling. And then so you throw in another 6 month series, missed 2 years of his prime, and he hasn't been injured. He's just, on circumstances and such have cost him that. So it's very interesting. And that's kind of my last loser of 2020. And with that, I think we're going to wrap it up. That's, like I said, this is going to be our last show of 2020. Um, Thanks everyone for tuning in this week and all the past episodes. We appreciate any comments and support we get. Just doing this for fun, just something that we started to kind of put together um, this year to entertain ourselves and to get some podcasting reps in. So we appreciate anyone who tunes in each week. Jason, anything else you want to say?
No, just obviously put in your comments on the comment section down below of your winners and losers
Yeah,
of 2020. Put up other suggestions, some names or promotions, whatever that we didn't name. Put those out there. Talk to us on Twitter as well on the Gentleman Wrestling Podcast. Twitter account or our personal Twitter accounts. Obviously we want to hear from you as well of your winners and losers from this.
Yeah, we're gonna get flooded by me people making fun of me for thinking Asuka was in Stardom. I was gonna. All right. Well, again, like I said, thanks a lot, everyone. Have a good holiday season if you're listening to this. Or Happy New Year, and hopefully stay safe. And we'll talk to you again in 2021. Thanks a lot.